Thank you, Yangtila. Actually, I was just speaking with a member of the Italian Parliament, who is someone who is a longtime Tibet supporter. He happens to be here in Boston and Cambridge right now, but he's a longtime Tibet supporter, and he was expressing his extreme concern over the now 51 Tibetans who have self-immolated, who have lit their bodies on fire inside Tibet in protest of China's occupation. I've been traveling, going to meetings, talking with people who say, oh yeah, I've heard that Tibetans, there's been these self-immolations. How many has it been now? And when I say in the last year we've had almost 50, people cannot believe it. It leaves people speechless. When we talk about who these Tibetans are that are lighting their bodies on fire, it's not just one type of person inside Tibet. It's monks, it's nuns, a mother of 3 children, nomadic people. Just today is the 29th, just 2 days ago, the 50th and 51st self-immolation inside Tibet, they were a 17 and an 18-year-old. One monk and one former monk. And so, I mean, we all know it very well. The time that we're living in is extremely traumatic. It's so disturbing. I feel like we are all living at a low level of kind of trauma, because every time, again, we open the email, we look online, we get news of yet another Tibetan life, precious life, lost to China's occupation of Tibet. Tibetans inside Tibet are giving their lives in this way because they feel at this point it's the best thing that they can do with their life, is offer it as in protest and as sacrifice for the struggle for the cause of Tibetan freedom. And that is something that is, I don't know that there are any words that are adequate to describe what kind of courage, strength, commitment, and suffering that these people must be going through to feel. Tibetans inside Tibet must, the suffering they're going through to feel that this is the best way that they can serve the Tibetan struggle. But as we've discussed before, and I'll just say it again, the Tibetans who are committing these acts of self-immolation, these ultimate sacrifice and protest, they are clear with their message. They are not deranged. They are not desperate and out of control. They're clear in their message. And we've seen this in what the letters that they have left, the words that they have spoken, audio recordings. They've been very clear that they believe Tibet can and will be free. They believe Tibetans can be free again, will have rights again, should have rights, and that His Holiness the Dalai Lama should return to Tibet. And it's for that cause that they offer their bodies and their lives in full understanding of what they're doing. Not in the way that we tend to, especially, in the West, we might look upon a suicide as some kind of deranged act of a person who's not clear in their mind. This is not what that is. These people are committing the highest act of protest, and nonviolent protest, in the sense that they're not turning violence on the Chinese. They're not attacking, after all these years of suffering, they're not attacking the Chinese military, the Chinese police, the Chinese settlers in their towns and their villages. They're just simply turning inward and sacrificing their own lives. And this is something that is so remarkable. And whether we agree with it or not in the big picture as a strategy, we have to honor their sacrifice. We have to talk about their sacrifice. The Tibetan community of Boston has been coming here every single Wednesday since 2008, the March Uprising, to honor the sacrifices of the Tibetans inside Tibet, to draw attention to their suffering. And now more than ever, it's so important. I'm about to do an interview with a journalist in Beijing. He wants to know, he wrote me an email and he said, I don't understand, why isn't the world doing anything? What is it about the Tibetans that they don't count? Is it that in the international community Tibetans don't matter? What do you think it is? That people don't know about this, or they're not taking action. And I think this is the key. Governments know. International governments know what's happening inside Tibet. They're very aware. Unfortunately, they are not moving beyond the kind of action they used to take. They're still continuing to pursue a sort of soft approach with the Chinese government. And each country, the US and Canada and maybe the Germans and the Norwegians, on their own, each country sort of approaches China and approaches the Chinese leaders and says, you should be nicer to the Tibetans, you should treat them better, they should have more rights, and kind of gently pushes them, barely causing any kind of discomfort for the Chinese leadership. And because each government, the US and everybody approaches them separately, the Chinese authorities just sort of laugh and they push back and they threaten. And if one government stands up here, the Chinese threaten trade retaliation and sanctions, and they're going to cancel business contracts. And so a lot of these governments quietly, slowly kind of back away. And they've been fooled into believing, some of them, that there's really not that much they can do on Tibet. It's simply not true. It is absolutely a lie. And what we are calling for now is multilateral action, a multilateral approach where governments get together and approach the Chinese and deal with the Tibetan issue in a unified, cohesive way, where they coordinate their information, where they coordinate their response, where they coordinate their approach to Beijing. The Chinese government fears this a great deal. The Chinese government does not want to see the international community get together on the Tibetan issue. They don't want to see governments standing together in a coordinated approach. They know this is dangerous. Friends of Syria, that's an international multilateral approach to helping to try to solve the Syrian conflict right now. Kosovo, before Kosovo became independent, there was a contact group, there was the establishment of a committee of nations, different representatives of different countries that came together to try to address the issue of Kosovo freedom, independence, the atrocities that were happening there. The same can and should be true for Tibet. We have to demand our governments coordinate an approach together. And the Chinese government will not like this. They will scream, they will shout, they will threaten. But I cannot believe that the international community can't stand up in some kind of strong, principled approach to the Chinese authorities. We've been calling for multilateral action for some time now. For the first time, 2 weeks ago, we saw a little bit of progress. Representative Wolf and Representative McGovern, two U.S. congressmen, wrote a letter to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton saying that we need to do something more. The crisis in Tibet, the crisis of self-immolations of the Tibetan people, and China's continued and brutal crackdown inside Tibet right now demands a new approach. And they asked U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to lead, to spearhead some kind of new initiative, an international conference, an initiative maybe at the opening of the UN General Assembly this September. Something perhaps together with, and they named the governments, perhaps the Canadians, perhaps the Czechs. They named a few governments that might be willing to participate. This is a signal from the political powers that be that there is actually a political will to address the Tibetan issue in a new way. And this is very good for us, and we must push our own government representatives, we must push the US government, the Canadian government, to get involved in this initiative, to demand that they do something more. And from the Tibetan side especially, and from the Tibetan government side, and from the Tibet support groups, it's not enough to call for the Chinese to talk to the representatives of His Holiness or to talk to the Tibetan government. We've been doing that for a decade. The Chinese know that strategy, they know how to undermine it. And for the US government and for the Canadian government, it's an easy out. It lets them off the hook. When we say to them, all we want you to do is push the Chinese to talk to our representatives, then the Canadians and the Americans very happily say, okay, great, China, you should talk to the Tibetan representatives. And then the Chinese say, sure, we'll think about it. And then they laugh and walk away. And that lets the US off the hook. Enough of this calling for talks. What we need to call for is action. Talks can come one day down the road when there's actually a chance for a real solution. But the strategy of calling for talks, it doesn't work. It's over a decade. 51 Tibetan lives, 51 Tibetans who have died, who have lit their bodies on fire, do not need us to continue to pursue a strategy that will not work in the short term. They need us to start a strategy and approach that will, in the long term, actually have the chance to make the Chinese move. And that is multilateral action. World governments need to get together on Tibet. There are many diplomatic mechanisms that they could engage in to try to push a little bit of progress for the Tibetan issue. And that's what we need now. And that should be our call. If we don't ask for it, nobody else will ask for it for us. So Tibetans, we must demand global response, this multilateral action. That's what this Enough campaign is about. And finally, we're seeing governments and political representatives who are interested, who think this is a good idea, who care about Tibetan lives. So when I talk to this journalist, this is what I'm going to talk about. It's not that governments don't know, they know. And now it's time for the people to demand a coordinated response on the Tibetan issue. There's no reason why it can't be. Right now, my colleagues at Students for a Free Tibet, Tenzin Dorji, Executive Director, they've been traveling around with this document, the 100 years since the 13th Dalai Lama wrote like an assertion of Tibetan independence. 100 years since the 13th Dalai Lama declared, in a way, reasserted Tibetan independence. And we have to remember, right now it might seem like maybe, it's too hard, the Chinese won't move, things won't really change, what can we do? World governments aren't really going to take a strong stand for Tibet. But we can never, ever give up and believe that the circumstances that are right now will always be. Everything changes. History teaches us that lesson, and Tibetan history certainly teaches us that lesson. 100 years ago, when the 13th Dalai Lama declared Tibetan independence, it was just months after he'd been living in exile in India because the Qing dynasty and the Manchus had controlled, invaded, and occupied Tibet. Just months before he wrote that beautiful document. He was living in exile like our great spiritual political leader, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, lives in exile in India. You never know, we never know what might happen tomorrow or the next week or the week or the month after that. And we owe it to Tibetans, as the 13th Dalai Lama gave us this legacy, this beautiful document that reminds us of our right and the world, of the historical fact of Tibetan independence. We in this moment owe it to Tibetans inside Tibet and all those people who are sacrificing their lives right now to fight for something more and to have a vision and to work towards it and not just be resigned to the same strategies and the same path and the same call. We need to do more. We can be more creative, and there are political representatives, there are people in the world. There's over 60,000 people now who have signed this Enough petition on Stand Up for Tibet, or 50,000. And we have another petition online with 2 million signatures. It's not that people don't care, but we need to lead, and we need to be stronger, and we need to call for more action. That's our job. On today, as 51 Tibetans now have given their lives, that's what I'm committed to working towards, and I trust that everyone here will work towards that same goal in their memory and in their honor. Thank you.